Welcome and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Jane Irrigation Training Series. I'm Richard Restuccia, Vice President of Water Management Solutions for Jane Irrigation, and I'm really excited today to be talking about smart controllers. And we talk about smart controllers a lot in our irrigation series. And one thing's for sure is I think we've established, but we're going to get some additional commitment on this, but I think we've established that smart controllers work. And I think one of the things that is having people giving them some trouble about smart controllers is why they're not being used more throughout the industry, right? We think that possibly the commercial use of smart controllers across the country might be somewhere in the 15 to 20% use range. You think, wow, it should be a lot higher than that when we've shown something that can save water as well as a smart controller. So one of the issues that comes up is, what's the education? What's the training? What's maybe holding people back from using smart controllers? And to help us through that journey today is Dr. Michael Dukes. And Michael Dukes has a tremendous reputation in the study of smart controllers. He's been doing it for a long time. He's the director for the Center for Land Use Efficiency, and he's a professor of agricultural and biological engineering at the University of Florida, and has really studied smart controllers, irrigation efficiency, so that irrigation doesn't waste water or nutrients. It's a really important combination, and he's really put the time in on this. He's also very active with the Irrigation Association, and in 2014, he was awarded the Excellence in Education from the IA. So as you can see, I'm really excited to talk with him about smart controllers because this is a guy who knows them really well. So Dr. Dukes, welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Appreciate the kind introduction and the invitation to talk today. So
yeah, well, you certainly deserve it. So before we get into smart controllers, though, I'm really curious to hear, how are things at the college? You mentioned earlier that maybe we're not going to be using masks anymore. Are the students back? Are people excited? What's that whole outlook look like right now?
yeah, I think it's largely positive. As I said, I heard yesterday and today again from some of our leadership that we can expect that masks will be optional very soon. And the plan for reopening or resumption of standard activity, whatever term you want to use, is that we'll be fully back to pre-COVID conditions sometime this summer. So very, very exciting.
Yeah, that is very exciting. And boy, I'm ready. I am ready.
Yeah, as are we.
Back to some semblance of normalcy.
Yep. Look forward to it.
Yeah, so listen, I want to kick this off with, I made a couple statements about smart controllers working, and of course, that's my opinion, and I have a biased opinion, right? I'm in this smart controller business, have been in for, a long time. So from your unbiased scientific research that you've done, do smart controllers save water?
Yeah, well, short answer is yes. Let me put up a couple slides and we'll talk through this.
Okay, and while you're doing that, I'll remind everybody that we do have the chat and the Q&A open. So if you have some questions for Dr. Dukes, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll get them to him as needed and as appropriate.
Yeah, so Richard, here I'm showing just a screen capture of a paper that I recently wrote and is published as part of a decennial irrigation symposium, which we couldn't actually have. It's part of the IA, actually. It's the ASAB, the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers, does this every 10 years, and it's part of the IA show traditionally. And of course, we couldn't do it last year because it was canceled. So we're going to do it this year in San Diego, actually, in December. But anyway, this paper kind of goes over the last 10 years or so of research. And there's a table in here that sort of summarizes all that research since approximately 2011, 2010. And here's the bottom line. So yes, they do in all these studies, whether they were on the left, plot-based studies, more research type of studies where we attempt to control all the variables except for the one we're studying. So in this case, water savings by smart controllers. And then on the right side there, you see, and this is the blue is low and the green is high. So it's a range. And on the right side, you see these were residential studies, and these were done in various locations around the country. So you see in the real world, quote unquote, as real as you can get it, still study it, about a 30% savings or so, and then anywhere from 40 to 60 in these research trials. So to answer your question in a long-winded type of way, yes, they do save water.
Yeah, so that's really good to hear. And I very much appreciate the studies. One of the things I wonder about, though, is it important, right, that we can actually save this water? I mean, relative to other things, is there a lot of water used in landscape?
It depends. It really is it's a regional issue. Every utility has its own distribution of usage, meaning there are some high users, and as you and I had chatted about, typically in a utility profile, there's a small number that are very small number of customers that are really excessive users. But that doesn't mean the other users, just because they're low from sort of an annual or a monthly usage standpoint, aren't actually, that doesn't mean they're not wasting water. They could be using it inefficiently, just in smaller groups. So I think that's pretty common.
But as a crop, is there a lot of turf grass, for example, in the United States compared to other crops?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's the number one. It's the largest irrigated crop, more plant type really, than any other.
Yeah, I think that's a surprise to a lot of people when they hear that, right? Because they you think of, just vast fields of corn or soybeans or cotton being grown, but when you think about all that turf, right, it is it's a lot more, right?
Yeah, turf and landscapes.
Yeah. Yeah. So then the other thing we hear a lot about is wasted water in landscapes. EPA and others maybe say 50%, as high as 65% of the water is wasted. What are your feelings about that? Is that an accurate number? How does that number come about?
I think a lot of times that number, the 50%, is it's people have asked me, well, where does that come from? And it's really hard to track that down. We have some small scale studies here in Florida with utilities, and it is around 50. It's maybe in the 40s to the 60s. It depends on how you analyze that data, uh, and so on. But it is around that number. So there's some truth to it, but it's kind of like a rule of thumb. There's always some truth to rules of thumb, but they're not necessarily right all the time everywhere.
Right. So, well, that's definitely interesting. Now, one of the things I learned early on in my career is when I was at Valley Crest, I would explain to the branch managers that we were going to save our customers money,
Hmm.
and by reducing the amount of water that we were using. And they always came back early on, often, I won't say always, but often they came back and they said, well, this is great, Rich. We're going to save our customers a bunch of water and a bunch of money, but they're going to fire us because the jobs are going to look terrible.
Yeah.
Was that, do you see any evidence of that?
Um, there can be, but then you're getting into, when you go down that line of thought or that road, you get into, well, how well is the irrigation system applying that water? When you start applying less and less to get the impact on the plants or to maintain plant quality, you have to be getting the water to where the plants need it and when they need it.
Yeah, I think that helps. And I think, we were able to see early on that the landscapes, many of the landscapes ended up looking better, having an appropriate amount of water instead of being, washed out. So,
Yeah. One other thing I was gonna, going the wrong way. Here we go. So when you're talking about, this is kind of a busy graph. I'll talk a little bit about it, but in terms of wasted water, the columns here are the warm season turf grass requirements for Florida, North Florida specifically. Slightly different in South Florida. It's a little higher, as you might expect, since it's warmer there for longer. But in terms of water waste, where we see, whoops, This is kind of the story that most people think of when they think of excess irrigation, where it's too much all the time. But that's just not the case most of the time. Certainly this occurs, and these are the sort of the poster children of what not to do. But more likely, the waste is in the shoulder seasons. And for us, since we irrigate all year round, it would be having irrigation in the wintertime too frequently or too much when it does occur. So irrigation can really be reduced in the wintertime months here. And if you actually look at our curve, in most of this is a subtropical pattern here, where it kind of peaks in April and May, this time of year right now, and that's because ET is high in April and May, and our summer rainy season hasn't started. In most of the country, this is a bell curve, so you would peak in July, and you wouldn't even have irrigation at all in the wintertime. So it's when you're going into and coming out of the irrigation season, that's the place we see irrigation most likely to be excessive. You just don't need as much as you think you need. So that's what I've done here with these two red boxes to kind of show that.
That's a great chart, and that really helps you visually see where some of the significant savings can be. I especially see that right in the fall, where you might even be getting some warmer summer temperatures extending into September and October, but the days are getting much shorter, so there's not a transpiration, and man, that's the time to really save. Where else can we see some significant savings on residential irrigation? Where should people be looking? Additional areas in their smart controllers, other parts of their systems?
Well, one of the things about smart controllers is you need to have a functional irrigation system to start with. I mean, you don't want to put a smart controller on a system that has leaks and clogs and things like that. So that's really got to be brought up to speed. And in the industry, we can argue all day about having a DU of 70% versus a DU of 78%. But that's a fine line. I think let's clean up all the problems, the breaks and leaks and things like that first, and then we can argue about perfection. So let's not let perfection be the enemy of the good.
Right. Let's not let it get in the way of progress.
Yeah.
So if we're thinking that we do save money and water with smart controllers and other irrigation changes that we can make, do you think we'll start to see more legislation on restricting what you can use, or telling people, more this prescriptive way to manage water?
I think so. I think, and this is an interesting question because there's always, debates around this question. We've seen it here. I think the answer to that is simply a yes too, but as you dive into it, we've definitely seen it here in the county that I'm in, Alachua County, Florida. They passed an ordinance, an irrigation ordinance, where all new systems have to have a smart controller. So boom, you're seeing that. California, I think you've got legislation that requires that as well. And in other municipalities, we're seeing that. So yeah, I think we're seeing that, and some other things that we're seeing in Florida, again, is in areas that are becoming water supply constrained. You're seeing changes by utilities, like some of them are talking about water budgets. And I know that's not a revolutionary thing. That's been utilized in the West for a number of years, but it's kind of a new idea here. So they're talking about water budgets or allocations, really. You get 25 inches of water for your landscape, and that's it. The industry's changing. We've got home builders and developers who are putting in less irrigated area. Yeah. Irrigated front yards, non-irrigated backyards. So we're seeing a number of changes in response to whatever the local water situation might be.
We definitely see here in California, prescriptive, have to have a smart controller, and we're also seeing performance-based. If you keep your water use under this number, your rate will be lower. Mm-hmm. What's your experience? Do you see either one of those working better than the other?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, actually. I think it really depends on how it's done. I think the actual process of implementing that's probably more important than either one of those, because it's a new way of going about things, so it has to be um, carefully done. I mean, it has to be done with intention. We have a utility here who they've been doing rebates for smart controllers, and they've learned an awful lot. You know, they've learned a lot about how much contractors knew, how much they thought they knew, and you know, as they work through that process, just dealing with issues as they came up and solving them, they've really had a lot of success with implementation of that program and making sure it saved water. One of the things they learned was that the contractors really needed, and I know we're going to talk about this, they really needed education on the smart controllers. So that was really a big deal for them.
Yeah, so that's something I want to get to, right? Because I think that's really important is why we're not seeing more. And we have a question from one of our viewers, and they're asking, using a smart controller, but some areas are getting overwatered, and they're recommending to that person that, it's really important that you input the right information into your controller. Is that good advice? Is that a first place to look if you start to think your controller's overwatering?
Yeah, it's critical. You know, programming and in the early days of working on smart controllers, our question was, do they work? Well, over time, we found that they did, and you know, there's nuances between the type of technology and across different brands and so forth. But by and large, they do save water, and it became clear to us that installing them properly and programming them properly became very important. So that can't be overemphasized.
Yeah, that's I think that's a great point, and because I think of it really, and check me on this, but I just consider it science, good science, right? We know what the variables are, we know what ET is, and so we know how much we have to replenish the soil to get the proper amount of water for our specific plants. But if we
Yeah.
don't know what the specific plant is, or if we're not sure on the root depth, or we program in the wrong irrigation device, this is
Yeah.
where we start to have the problems, right?
Yeah. We've seen just in general with ET controllers getting the field measuring the application rate or precipitation rate. That is very important for ET controllers because they're an open loop type of control device. They unless you have a flow sensor, the controller doesn't know what's going on. It's sending a signal, and then you know that type of system assumes that the water is running, but you
Yeah.
don't know unless you have a flow sensor. So, and we didn't talk about this before, but that's, you know, I see the industry, I see flow sensors, that's becoming more and more important in the industry. But in any case, um, you got to have that application rate programmed properly. If the controller thinks it's applying 2 inches per hour and you're applying a half inch per hour, that's a problem, or vice versa.
Yeah, and I think the other place where we see trouble too is if you have a controller that you still put in a baseline program, but that program's incorrect and you're just adjusting off of that, you would still have some issues, right?
Yep. It's a problem from day one. So, and that's the challenge now with smart controllers. It's, you know, once you get someone um, to think that, yeah, I want to use this device, or contractor, I want to put these in, and then you start going down through all these nuances, it becomes difficult for them.
Yeah, and so that's I think that's what you do so well is your understanding of uh, why more people aren't using smart controllers, and a lot of it has. And you've got some interesting points on this, right? Some of it has to do with education, some other things. I'd love to hear what you think on this.
Yeah, well, I'm biased because I'm an educator, so you know, but we have done studies with colleagues looking at the what I call the human factor. You know, what influences people to utilize this technology, what influences them to utilize it successfully, and so forth. So the human factor can't be over underemphasized. Um, you know, the manufacturers have done a great job in packaging this complicated technology with all the math and everything, the hydraulics and so forth, to something as simple as possible. But it is still a complicated thing. You know, there's a lot of moving pieces, and to get the right amount of water at the right spot at the right time, you know, it's still complicated. So you have to really have to understand how that controller is working.
Yeah, a few years ago, I had a customer, well, we had a summer in San Diego where I didn't open my windows until August. I mean, it was a cold summer.
Hmm.
And I was getting congratulated for being a great water manager. I'm like,
Yeah,
I'd like to take the credit, but it's just cold.
yeah,
We're not
right,
using that much water. So we probably saw a lot of water savings that year. And the next year, I knew what was coming, right? Hey, you
right,
use more water.
right, right.
And I think it's important, right? This education to let people know that it's you're not necessarily going to see a cumulative savings every year because there is a baseline.
Yeah, yeah. That's why, you know, the pre-post analyses, a lot of utilities utilize pre-post analyses, and consultants utilize pre-post analyses. They're good, but they're not necessarily the only way I think you ought to think about looking at water usage, water savings. What we normally do is we'll do the pre-post, and then we'll normalize it for weather variation. So we'll calculate a net irrigation requirement based on plant type, soil depth, soil type, and climate. And that really allows you to compare apples to apples from one year to the next. So it would take into account that cool year or a cool summer you had.
Yeah, that's great to hear, right? Because we know people do this on energy,
Mhm.
right? People who manage energy always have a environmental factor in there, right? If it's hotter this summer, I'm going to use more air conditioning. How does that, true out?
Exactly.
So you're starting to see a little bit of this in water.
Well, we do it in our own research. I don't know that it's caught on across the board. I mean, you have seen that in some studies, like the residential end uses study, where they have normalized for I forget what they call the factor, but it's basically ET minus rainfall or ET minus some sort of effective rainfall factor, so that you can normalize and account for um, you know, cooler or warmer years, wetter or drier years when you're comparing year to year.
Yeah, it's great to see. I think it's so important as we start to look at this data moving forward. And again, it's part of that education of the customer because if a customer doesn't see water savings right off the bat, how excited are they going to be about installing a smart controller?
Yeah, you know that I don't know if it's this interesting thing. People get excited about saving water and smart controllers when we have a drought. Well, the I guess irony is that when we have a drought, we need water. The plants need to be irrigated. And so that's not where you're going to get your savings typically. If you do get savings, you're going to have a quality issue with your plants, with your landscape. Where we see the savings is, like I said, in the shoulders seasons. We also see it during our rainy summers. So if you're in a climate that does get rainfall, that's a great time to save water. I mean, we've seen in some of our studies with smart controllers that you might not irrigate for 2 or 3 months in the summer. We get a
Right.
lot of rain. We get a lot of frequent rainfall, so that's good. But in other climates with rainfall, that's where the smart controller is going to shine.
Yeah, it's great to hear. Now, have you seen any contractors that are doing a really good job on education of their customers or education of contractors in general? Are there some models out there that you can point to?
Um, I would say in our market, we're a little. I would say we're kind of behind on from that standpoint. There's not as much education as I would like to see with smart controllers. But local utilities that we are working with, we often do training events for contractors to try to get them at some baseline of knowledge. But I just had a meeting the other day, and we were talking about a rebate program. We're working with Tampa Bay Water here, and the point I made was for a contractor, a lot of contractors will prefer a certain brand or a certain model. And that makes a lot of sense for them because they can quickly become experts and they can train their staff to become experts in that controller. But if you tell them, well, you have to be an expert in 10 or 15 different types of controllers, that's going to be really difficult for them to do.
Yeah, some centralization, right? This
Yeah.
whole concept of learn it here and you can use it on any account.
Yeah.
That's great.
And another thing I've seen, there are some contractors or developers who they prefer a certain type of controller, and they really like the ones where they can go into the database and see what's happening and actually exert control remotely on those devices. Um, they really, really, if they take advantage of that, they really like that feature because they can troubleshoot. They can a customer has a problem, they can just go in online and maybe solve it right then.
Yeah. So, do you think cost of controllers is another issue for a lot of people, or are they seeing enough water savings to where it makes sense to them? Or
Yeah, cost is always an issue. It's not as much of an issue now as it was in the early days. I mean, you remember back in the day when these were $500 or even more for a controller. Now they're much more reasonable. Maybe a couple $100, maybe less, maybe some even less than $100. So that's not as much of an issue as it was. I don't think it's a deal breaker. And as far as linking water savings with ROI on the controller, I don't see that done a lot. I mean, they do have an ROI. We've shown that in several utilities here, particularly the higher the rates are. And if you have a tiered rate structure where, you go over a certain cap and you are charging more per gallon. So they definitely pay off. I don't see that used though. I don't see that used by the industry to sort of sell the idea.
yeah, I agree with you. And even on our large commercial programs, right, where a controller might be several $1,000s because it's so many zones and doing so many things, including like flow management, like you said. Oftentimes we could do and we can do return on investment analysis and show, these are people that might be spending 200,000-300,000 a year on water.
Yeah.
We can start to show this value pretty quickly.
Mhm.
Typically, if somebody's saving, if the ROI on it is less than 24 months, people get really interested in this in pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We've seen that. That's kind of the figure I recall that we looked at when we did the analysis, and that was years ago with more expensive controllers. Now they've come down. So
Yeah. What about rebate programs in Florida? Is this a big thing? Has it been? Has it been successful?
yeah, I think so. It's kind of isolated, and certain utilities kind of do their own things to meet their local customer needs. But yeah, it's been successful in a number of cases. And like I said, we're working with Tampa Bay Water to help them implement a large rebate program that they're doing that will offset the cost of future supply. So it's a really big deal for them.
Yeah, one thing you and I were talking about earlier this week, when we talked about rebates, we talked about contractors, we talked about the contractor job, working all day, trying to find the labor, which is really hard to find, doing your invoicing at night, going to buy stuff. I mean, it is a hard job and it's long hours. I think you were talking about some contractors that you've talked to recently that have been thinking about maybe pulling back. And
Yep.
why would they do that?
Yeah, we have a company that I know pretty well here, and we were in a meeting the other day, and they made a comment that for the first time ever, they've talked about shrinking their business when there's plenty of business to be had out there, and the number one thing is labor for them. They just cannot get quality labor, and they refuse to do um, non-quality work. So I hadn't heard that. That's a new one for us.
Yeah, it is, right? And I heard that a lot last year too. I learned to ask the question, were you busy last year? And everybody was busier last year than they've ever been.
Yep.
Then if I asked, did you make more money last year? And they'll say, no. We worked harder, but we made less money. We had to
Yeah.
pay more for labor. We had to pay more for materials. So we were working harder, but making less
Yep.
overall.
Yep.
And that is a tough way to go.
Yeah. Indeed.
So, well, listen, kind of a final thought, final question here. Somebody who's thinking about putting in a smart controller, do you have any advice for them?
Um, get educated.
Yeah.
I mean That's the bottom line. There's plenty of resources to educate yourself on the technology. And, if you're a contractor, definitely do the same. I think there's potential for contractors since smart controllers have not, um, they're not the majority of the controller market and not even close. There's the opportunity for a contractor to basically make a sale, sell the technology to customers. So that's exciting.
I think so. I know that there's many maintenance contractors out there bidding maintenance jobs for 30% margin, but they might be getting better than 50% margins for their irrigation repairs or irrigation recommendations. And certainly, it's competitive out there to get the job, and 30% margin is not going to make you wealthy. That's for sure. I mean, it's going to be hard to be profitable.
Yeah.
But man, when you can put in a smart controller, save your customer money, conserve the water. I mean, we need it. That's kind of exciting for everybody.
Yeah. Another thought, I had run into a consultant some years ago now, and this person's business model was they would, analyze your situation, and basically you didn't pay them. They got paid on the savings. Have you heard of that lately?
Yeah, I've seen that model
Yeah.
a couple times.
That's pretty bold. That's kind of like jumping out of an airplane with no parachute.
Well, it is, because again, if you get the really hot summer the next year, you may have a problem.
Yeah.
But I know one contractor in Las Vegas was doing this very successfully. And when I asked him, I actually wrote an article about it because it was so interesting. And he said, picking your customer to offer that to is really important.
Yes.
You say you've got the deficit irrigators, it won't work with them, but we
Yes.
know the water wasters. You see it
Yeah.
from a long ways away. And he said, that's who we go after.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's a great point. So, well, Dr. Dukes, thank you so much for coming on and sharing this information and your time with us today. I certainly appreciate it. I know our viewers appreciate it too. I hope you'll come back in the future to talk more about smart controllers, because we love that subject.
Sure. Glad to do it.
Yeah. So, and I just want to remind everybody, you can see all our videos on Jane's USA/trainings. We're also on, we convert all these to podcasts. So we're on Spotify, Google, Apple, and iHeartRadio podcasts as well. So as you're driving from job to job or just out and about, walking, running, whatever you do, it's a great way to learn as well. So Dr. Dukes, thanks again. Thanks everybody. And I hope everybody has a great weekend.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you.